All right, everyone, we're going to get started. Thank you all so much for coming to the IGERT program on Ocean Change Winter Seminar Series. For those of you who aren't familiar with our program, the IGERT program explores the themes of ocean change from a multidisciplinary perspective and with a focus on connecting scientific inquiry with real-world problem solving. I want to thank the Joint Institute of the Study of Atmosphere and Ocean Sciences and the National Science Foundation for providing funding for our seminar series. And I want to invite you afterwards to join us for a reception in the lobby and also every Tuesday for the rest of the quarter at the same time, so we have a lot of great speakers lined up. Our seminar's theme this year is on the front lines of ocean change. We wanted to explore current impacts on communities, industries, and ecosystems. And I'm thrilled to announce Maxine Burkett as our first speaker for this series. When we were considering who to invite to speak, as soon as Professor Burkett's name was suggested, everyone was extremely enthusiastic, and we have since heard excitement from around the university. Professor Burkett's focus on the legal ramifications of changing oceans on island nations fits perfectly with our seminar theme. An associate professor at the William S. Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii, Professor Burkett is an expert in the law and policy of climate change and has presented her research on diverse areas of climate law throughout the United States, in West Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Caribbean. Professor Burkett attended Williams College and Exeter College in Oxford University and received her law degree from Bolt Hall School of Law at the University of California, Berkeley. From 2009 to 2012, she served as the inaugural director of the Center for Island Climate Adaptation and Policy and led projects to address climate change policy and planning for island nation communities around the world. In 2010, Professor Burkett served as the youngest recipient of the Wayne Morse Chair of Law and Politics at the Wayne Morse Center at University of Oregon. So please join me in welcoming Professor Burkett.
Can you hear me? Okay, so this actually works for talking to all of you. Yeah. I'm sorry, Jenny. I've been sitting here all day. We thought you were in Alaska. Are you here? Good to see you. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's amazing right at the beginning to see your face because I was just thinking about the last couple of times I've been on campus, and they've all been so wonderful. The 3 Degrees Conference several years ago, and then a wonderful environmental law scholars workshop that I was attended a couple summers ago here on campus, and it's just a beautiful place to be, no matter what time of year, even winter time. It was 7 this morning when I woke up, and I was like, what, is it 7 p.m. or 7? I but anyway, it's really lovely to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. The IGERT program is something that I knew about. I believe I was even on a team applying for one, so I'm happy to be affiliated in some way. And hopefully this talk helps to round out some of the issue areas that you're looking at and think about some of the more novel areas that we're now being forced to think about as a result of climate change and migration. And I usually open with this slide just because I thought it was so visually stunning and stark, but then it just seemed like an excellent metaphor. Does anyone know, have you seen this image before? Know what this is?
Yes. I don't want to ruin it.
Oh no, this is the punchline part. So you can
Spider webs?
Yeah, this is in Pakistan. This is after the major floods in 2010. I thought this image was so fascinating and sort of to force the metaphor a bit was an amazing example of how species migrate under stressful circumstances. The floodwaters in 2010 were so intense and took so long to recede that spiders took refuge into the trees, and this is what happened to their community afterwards. But what I'm talking about today is really about people, and I realized as I was sort of preparing the talk and the title that actually I probably should have put people in there somewhere because scientists, I before said migration and it could be like critters or assisted migration, and I'm this horrible search engine and I'm like, oh, this is about, oh no. But yeah, we're talking about the migration of people, and I just want to give an introduction to the issue first and focus a little bit less on the identifying solutions partially because we don't have very clear solutions, but at this point. We're just starting to think about them, but also because when I was doing this research initially, it was in response to a very specific question that was asked of a group of legal scholars thinking about migration and statelessness for small island communities. And so that's what I was looking at specifically. I'll make some reference to it a little bit later on, but this is basically what I'm going to do in the next 20 to 40 minutes, depending on how exhausted you look halfway through the talk. But first, I want to just sort of give a little bit of background on climate change, adaptation, migration, and justice, and just let you know that, again, I'm not a scientist, and so when I look at some of the data points, I look at it with the lens of a lawyer, as someone who's interested in justice issues and has a background in environmental justice and climate justice issues, and so kind of showing you how I see some of the science or how that's playing out is what I'll first do. And then I want to help us to sort of think more about the challenges of climate-induced migration and think about the global indicators of climate-induced migration. And I will note really quickly that the term climate refugee has gained a lot of traction and more formal discussion about climate-induced migration, but it's, I'll say more about this later, but it's not in the law world a meaningful term. And so I talk about climate-induced migration to describe what you might have seen popular discussion as climate refugees, and I refer to climate refugees as climate migrants or climate displaced and so on interchangeably. But suffice it to say, this is one of those, even terminology is one of the areas that fall under uncertainty, knowledge gaps, and dissent. And again, I'll say a little bit more about it, but to quote Donald Rumsfeld, who I'm sure is quoted quite a bit in seminars like this one, there are known knowns, there are things that we know, there are known unknowns, that is to say there are things that we know we don't know, but there are also unknown unknowns, or things we don't know we don't know, and I want to be sure to get that quote exactly as said. No, okay, we know that it's already occurring within countries, that climate-induced migration is already occurring within countries. Known unknowns, the unknowns that we know about are well, we don't know how many, by when, to where. And the unknown unknowns, it falls into the category of, what are we going to do in the face of slow onset disasters? How does ocean acidification impact the kinds of migration that we might see? What do we do with abrupt change? There are so many things that we can't even anticipate as a result of the sort of the nature of the climate piece, that there are some unknown unknowns that will muddy the discussion at large with respect to climate change, but certainly with respect to who moves, how they move, when they move, why they move, all of that. So there are a lot of uncertainties, and I want to try to tame those a little bit. And then there is this piece on migration, sovereignty, and statelessness that I want to focus on, because my research, perhaps a coincidence, but perhaps because I was born on an island, I grew up on Long Island, and I live in Hawaii. I'm concerned about islands, generally speaking, and a lot of the issues that face small islands are quite specific and may be able to be carved out of the larger climate-induced migration discussion for more immediate attention. So I say a little bit about that, and then we'll very briefly introduce an idea that I have about how we might address some of the nations that will have to respond to the issue of statelessness. And then I conclude. So, here we go. Climate change, adaptation, migration, and justice. This is the image I show my students, other people I talk with, folks that may not be as familiar with climate change. This I think suggests the slender atmosphere in which we live and the fragility of it. It's a beautiful photo, but I sort of describe how we are impacting the atmospheric chemistry and what that means. And then go to an economist to describe it for the layperson, right? Emissions are growing faster than we thought. The absorption capacity of the planet is less than we thought. The probability of high temperatures is slightly higher than we thought. And some of the effects are coming faster than we thought. And usually to describe this, we have seen other folks do this as well. There's the climate testimonial, right? There's that period where you talk about the impacts of climate change. It usually starts up in the Arctic region and talks about glaciers that are melting, as you see here, and compares glaciers like this one in Peru back in the 80s to the early 2000s, and we are really sort of moved by the differences in glacial pace as we see in these images. And this image in particular I love because it's the melting water streams from an iceberg that's calved from the Greenland ice sheet, and I think it's a gorgeous photo. Right? It's a beautiful photo until you pause and consider the implications. Emissions are soaring and climate impacts around the world are occurring with increasing frequency. And forecasts of sea level rise, which is related, are inherently uncertain, but are postulated at closer to 1 meter by 2100, if not more. And the implications of warming and melting for the most vulnerable and particularly hot spots, like the small island states in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, is considerable. In fact, it's existential. And countries like the Maldives, Tuvalu, Kiribati, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands risk inundation and risk uninhabitability prior to possible submersion, right, through compromised fresh water resources and loss of cropland. And there's a key justice element here, again, from the lens of a climate justice researcher. The communities that are most impacted are the least responsible, the ones that are the most vulnerable, that are really at the sort of the cutting edge of some of the most thorny legal questions are the ones that are least responsible. So sort of pivoting now to sort of a law perspective, a former colleague of mine at Ski Law School once remarked that she thought it might actually be illegal to present on climate change and not include a picture of a polar bear. So, here we go. And this one actually, Stephen Schneider shared with me years ago, and told a very great story about adaptation, right? That this is an amazing image and a sort of presentation of a species adapting to its environment over millennia, perhaps longer, millions of years. And it seemed to be such a powerful photo because we have a tendency to talk about environment and climate in a way that really there's the charismatic megafauna, right? There's the polar bear, of course, and this is a cute and cuddly picture. We want no part of it personally as humans. And I usually show this image as sort of a nice counterbalance to both adaptation and polar bears. The bad news is the ice cap is melting. It's almost going to be impossible to catch seals. The good news is if we keep moving south, there's tons of animals called humans who can't run very fast. This is another story of adaptation and migration, if you will. And the way we have, as humans, organized society and our geopolitical history, it makes our movement more complex. But we're going to see these kinds of calculations being made by various communities across the globe. And again, the climate conundrum has been animated by a number of very compelling stories, but there are, in addition to this most vulnerable species, communities that are right next door that are experiencing the kind of vulnerability that I'm talking about this afternoon. And the Arctic is a good example. It's identified as one of the canaries in the coal mine, but it is so as well for relocation. And it's getting a little less attention for that, but that's certainly what's happening right now. The availability of food, water, shelter, they're increasingly unpredictable at best. At worst, the permafrost and protective sea ice barriers are collapsing and forcing moves. There have been, as a result, relocation efforts explored in partnership with the federal government. But because these are unprecedented moves, and there's general political lethargy on the issue, and climate generally, on the issue of migration, several communities' attempts at relocating have been stalled, in some cases prohibited. And litigation efforts to gain relocation when it comes to oil and gas companies that are largely responsible for emissions have also suffered significant legal setbacks at all levels of the federal courts. So we have a scenario in which we're seeing examples, again, what we know is happening within countries. People are having to consider relocating as a result of the changing environment. Another example, and I'm quick to say that we can't say that the climate is a result of climate change, but to the extent that it provides a sort of a clear example of how cities may be vulnerable in more ways than one, it's an important one when we consider relocation and migration. It's estimated that during and after Hurricane Katrina, 1.1 million people in Louisiana were permanently or temporarily displaced, and that about 2 million people were displaced from the Gulf Coast region by Hurricanes Katrina and Rita that year. And at the time, the FEMA spokeswoman, Nicole Andrews, said, "We've never had a situation where an entire American city was evacuated and they weren't able to go home. These numbers represent that phenomenon." So it seems that we have been approaching, or we certainly are approaching, a new frontier. And I think Hurricane Sandy situated us squarely in that sort of broader space in terms of how we manage these kinds of impacts. And taking this to a global level, the International Displacement Monitoring Center reported that 32.4 million people around the globe were forced to flee their homes as a result of natural disasters in 2012. And of the 1.3 million people that were displaced from Western countries, the worst hit was the United States as a result of Hurricane Sandy, where at least 775,000 people were estimated to have been displaced. So we see that there's some impacts that we can identify in our own country that have a number of social implications and economic and financial implications for our country, and certainly management implications once we start dealing with them. And while Sandy was a significant event for the United States, the lion's share of the disaster-related migration has occurred in the global south, and the so-called climate refugee has captured the imagination of many as a result. So if we're looking at the global level, I think Sir David King's words has been the most compelling for me. He was speaking about sea level rise generally, I think more so from a scientific perspective, but he said the maps of the world will have to be redrawn. But as someone who's looking at it from a law and policy perspective, it seems obviously clear that the physical world is complicated by the lines that we've drawn on it, right? The political borders and maps that we've created. So the maps of the world having to be redrawn has some very significant implications. Initially, we're seeing most of the discussion and movement regarding climate migration happening in places like Bangladesh, and the implications for a very poor country in the global south in which flooding has increased and has had devastating impacts. We also, again, in 2010, saw the major flooding in Pakistan that disrupted 20 million people and was a significant event at the time that forced relocation and displacement in country for a significant period of time. And again, there is some clear human development implications that are the result of this kind of movement, both in that moment and in the periods afterward. Now, in terms of what we know we don't know, the uncertainties, I'd like to start with this particular graph. And what this graph is showing you here is that we see that there are a number of people that might move as sea level rises, right? But beyond just demonstrating the upward trend, this is probably totally wrong, right? In fact, all of the guesses at how many people might move are so wildly divergent. Some have said 25 million, some have said 1 billion. Very difficult range to plan for, and this has been quite difficult. To step back for a second, actually, I wanted to clearly identify some of the other things that we do know before, so delving back into the numbers game. Again, we know that it's already occurring within countries, it's occurring within our country, it's occurring within the Solomon Islands, where they're looking at moving entire municipal administrative center in Papua New Guinea, where islanders in the Atoll Islands and the Carterets are moving to Bougainville on the mainland. We also know that the poorest of the poor, the most vulnerable within the severely affected countries, usually cannot leave. And in fact, migration has this twin sort of element of being both a luxury and perhaps a devastating event for some communities. The idea here, though, is that individuals who have the capacity to leave will do so, whether it's for a particular, in response to a particular sudden or slow onset event, and that financial resources and community networks will say a lot about whether or not you can move. So will gender, and age, and education level, and skills, language acquisition, risk-taking capacity, and how that's viewed in their culture. And these things will affect movement. We also know that the indigenous are severely affected in these communities. That movement and relocation, by definition, is a disruption of systems of traditional knowledge, and displacement will often yield significant heritage and cultural loss. And so these are significant concerns. That's what we know, and we don't know exactly how we're going to respond to it. But then we get to this numbers issue, which has been a big one. We have seen a more common number that's used, which is 200 to 250 million. And this was a number that was derived by Norman Myers, who's an Oxford ecologist. And to get to that number, he himself said it involved heroic extrapolations. And so many of you recognize that that's a tough one to stand behind. But we've find that it's difficult to address the number, but using that number for a moment, just for perspective, the U.S. population is just over 300 million. The International Organization of Migration estimates we're about 200 million that are migrating worldwide at the moment. So we're looking at a huge increase in possible number of people. And we're also, again, recognizing that this is the result of extrapolations, we're looking at a phenomenon that will be sort of continue to be elusive, right? It's going to be difficult to ever really find a number that we can vigorously defend. But some scholars argue that we have to get to that number because clear numbers are necessary to raise awareness of an emerging crisis, to incite decision makers at all scales to actually respond to something, right? So it's harder to sort of encourage people and galvanize decision makers to respond to an abstraction. But settling on an appropriate number, settling on appropriate timescales, particularly for slow onset events, so the heat waves or the droughts or the rising sea levels that force you to move, these sorts of things are harder to identify, and the numbers are harder to identify. And in fact, there are difficulties in even understanding the stock and flow. In other words, how many people have moved by 2050, which is an often used year to measure, right? And the flow, which is at that moment in time, is it 250 million people in 2050 or 250 million once we get to 2050 that have already moved? These are some of the difficulties. Now, if you take that difficulty and then add academics to it, it becomes even more difficult. And what we're finding is that there's an interesting rift in the research on this question about who's moving and why they're moving. And there is a distinction between the so-called maximalists and the so-called minimalists. The maximalists, who've also been adoringly referred to as the environmentalists or alarmists, these are the folks that assume that environmental change is a major driver of migration and displacement, and whose estimates tend to be greater. And then there are the minimalists, or the migrationists, and these researchers tend to insist on the multi-causality of migration, the difficulty of just isolating climate as a clear signal. And what we're finding is that this rift in the scholarly discourse is sort of a setback for the entire endeavor. Many scholars find themselves arguing with the validity of the claims of large-scale induced migration, but at the same time, there are real data gaps, there are real questions that need to be answered, and there's certainly what I call legal black holes, where we have no idea how to address some of these novel phenomena, but still, there's enough indication that we need to address them. And then I'll say again a little bit more about this later, but there are small atoll nations that have unique kinds of issues that are clearly climate-induced, that will clearly force migration that we can address now. So those are some of the difficulties in terms of numbers. There's also the categories that we need to consider, the different kinds of displacement. And the need to address each is becoming more apparent. But each of the 5 categories has different policy and legal implications for governments, the people concerned, and the international agencies tasked with assisting these climate-induced migrants to find what we call durable solutions. So how do we categorize them? And each will determine which legal framework will be most relevant. And then we have this issue with respect to refugee. As I mentioned earlier, the climate refugee is not a term that we recognize in the law. It has no legal basis in international refugee law. And part of the reason we see clearly in Article 182 of the Refugee Convention. And I've highlighted the terms for you, but these have been some of the biggest hiccups, which is the fear of being persecuted, the element of persecution, the element of urgency, and the element of being a member of a class of people that benefit from this definition. These are the elements that are missing from the situation of the climate displaced or the climate migrant. And so the argument goes, right? And so that absence of an appropriate term to use is also quite significant because, as Professor Jane McAdams says, I think concisely and persuasively and accurately, legal definitions bind states in ways that descriptive labels cannot. So while we have the sort of political use of the term refugee, maybe it's helpful in terms of political exigencies, the way we describe the conversation in international negotiations. It may have sociological relevance, it reflects an empirical reality. It looks a lot like other kinds of refugee scenarios. it doesn't have legal weight if there's no international or national law that it's steeped in that allows for it to be a binding obligation on a state or a particular government. So this is a difficulty that we continue to struggle with. Now, layer that on to another area of difficulty, which is that there's several spheres of governance and related institutions, many areas of law that could own this issue. And they are international and national primarily. And this is what is so interesting and unique about the climate migration issue, is that really any of these could take this issue and run with it. But it's almost because there's so many that can, we have what William Busby described as the regulatory commons problem. Right? And so though a social ill is widely recognized, the existence of multiple potential managers actually prevents it from any one player taking responsibility. It's actually kind of the perfect example of a legal hot potato and the sort of the lack of policy that we see not being generated as a result. Another important consideration that I want to throw into the discussion is from David Karen. He's helped frame a lot of the issues that fall into these gaps, the gaps for consideration in terms of regulation and proper law policy response. And he wrote an article about this back in 1990, which is 25 years ago now, which is hurts my heart to say the number. It's been a long time he's been thinking about this issue. And he described this kind of feedback mechanism is borrowing from the terminology used in science to describe the positive feedback loops and the kind of phenomenon that accelerates the larger climate crisis. And what he was describing was the ways in which law can make climate change worse. And to be clear, in the context of climate change, there are some very straightforward things that the law can accomplish. There's litigation that's against proposed coal-fired power plants. You can work to design and implement state programs on greenhouse gas emissions reductions or adaptation plans. But there are many instances, like migration, I would argue, in which the absence of law or necessary amendments to current law exacerbate the experience of those that are suffering from the poor climate forecast. And so similar to positive feedback loops in climate science, David Karen had said legal feedbacks will not alter the amount of climate change, but will aggravate the suffering that will accompany such change. The greater the change, the greater the aggravation. And the only footnote I'd put on this is that I actually think the legal feedbacks have sort of made the climate change worse. Right? Our inability to have come to a fair, ambitious binding agreement under Kyoto and then after Kyoto, post-Kyoto, is actually a way in which we see legal feedbacks creating greater opportunities to continue to emit greenhouse gases and not to adapt appropriately. So there are a number of unresolved legal questions, like migration, like the issues of resettlement rights for those who are migrating, like dealing with issues of statelessness, that present aggravating legal feedbacks, and there are many that are sitting in the gaps and are concerned about what exactly they are to do as a result of the increases in sea level rise with respect to emissions. So, shifting to small islands, we see that there's a specific kind of scenario here that begs, I think, more immediate attention. This is our Pacific Climate team has actually put together this image, which is a really wonderful way to understand the various climate vulnerabilities that the island states have. And this could be Hawaii, this could be islands of the Marshalls, this could be Jamaica. Really describes the very diverse and many ways in which island communities are impacted. In the Caribbean and the Pacific Islands, more than half of the population resides within a mile of the shore. And almost without exception, international airports, roads, capital cities, all of these very core economic centers and social centers are sited along the coast or around tiny coral islands. I can attest to this. This is true everywhere from Honolulu to Kingston. And under most scenarios, climate change will likely seriously compromise water resources, which is always an issue in small islands, heavily impact coral reefs and fisheries, which are huge parts of the economy as well as important sources of food. And subsistence and commercial agriculture will be significantly compromise. And we know also that small islands are responsible for less than 1% of global greenhouse gases, and that small islands are really expending scarce resources to build vulnerability or adapt to climate threats. And of course, sea level rise is chief among those. You see that in this image, you're seeing that global mean sea level rose with greater intensity in the Western Pacific, which is where places like Kiribati and Tuvalu are. And places like Hawaii are set to see greater impacts as we get farther into this century. But for now, this is an image of flooding in Tuvalu, which has become more common. This is Funafuti. We know in Hawaii, we are set to suffer as a result of sea level rise. We're seeing some of that, some glimpses of that now, and we're also seeing some of the impacts of migration that might be attributable to compromised communities in the Marshalls and Micronesia, and existing political relationships between the United States and those countries that are causing a climate-driven exodus, as this particular report describes it, to Honolulu and other places on the mainland U.S. When we think about impacts, so the impacts that we see, this is, by the way, a nice moment to pause and reflect on Waikiki. What we're looking at here is a beautiful image, but primarily a wetland that has now become a major tourist destination and is quite vulnerable. So when we think about sea level rise in Hawaii, we're thinking about an incredible threat to a huge part of our economy. If we look farther west, or at least depending on which direction you're going, we're looking at Male and the Maldives. This is the economic center, the political center of the country, and it is at its highest point at about 8 feet. And so you're looking at a much greater impact as a result of climate change, and the Maldives has been more vocal about how their atoll nation will be impacted by climate change. And in 2009, they did a brilliant publicity stunt, which was that they held a cabinet meeting underwater to underscore the impacts of climate and the likelihood of them needing to move for their country to be relocated in the next generation or two. And this was in 2009, and they were signing and encouraging all of the international community to draft and sign a fair, ambitious, and binding post-Kyoto agreement that would help them avoid this possible fate. But ultimately, the political hot potato is really asking an important existential question, not just in terms of philosophy, but in terms of the law of it, which is how do you continue to be a state, or do you exist in the international community if you've lost your territory? They're asking how do you make policy underwater, literally and figuratively. The lack of a legally recognized definition, the lack of a clear statement of the rights of the people that don't have to move, these are things that are unclear at this point. And for places like the Maldives, there's an additional question as to what we do about statelessness. And statelessness is a question that's an interesting one. Because what we usually deal with when we talk about statelessness from a legal perspective is that there's been some issue with the deprivation of nationality, but it's not designed to deal with questions where there's no successor state that exists. There's no state that follows the one that you used to be a citizen of. And the predecessor state, the country that you know to be yours, has been rendered uninhabitable or has physically disappeared, right? So the questions that the Maldivians are asking on top of all the others is, when does the nation cease to be a nation? Can I maintain a government, much less an identity, if I have land that can no longer be inhabited? So these are some of the questions that were quite striking we were forced to consider. In 2011, I think we'll continue to consider. What I had done at the time is try to look at ways that we could think differently about statehood. And a lot of discussion has gone on about the validity, the possibility, the possible perils of considering deterritorialized statehood. So having a nation state that has no territory, but it still has international legal personality. I won't delve too deeply into this because we're at sort of the 30-minute mark, but I do want to bookmark that just in case you have more questions about it. Suffice it to say, so I sort of drafted up the possibilities. What would it look like? How can you justify deterritorialized statehood? And what would be some of the mechanics of it? I'm just sketching it out initially just to consider if it's at all possible. And it seemed to be something that, as much as it's a, I think, unfortunate question to have to even be considering to answer, it's one that is very real and present tense for a number of the island nations in this particular image. It's real. And what we know is that international law regards a couple of important elements for what we consider a state: a permanent population, a defined territory, a functioning government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. And many times I've given a presentation, or a full presentation, of territorialized statehood, and as soon as I get to part 3, some wonder if our particular government has been disqualified as a result of various specifics of political realities that we exist in. But there is some interesting conversation around how much we can interpret these particular legal rules to accommodate the realities that we're facing with respect to climate. So, in conclusion, I actually just wanted to share a couple of images that I think have really animated my thinking about the research trajectory I'm on at this point. And one is this watercolor, just seems really relevant. I don't know if you're familiar with Gregory Johnson. He's an oceanographer, and he was homesick one day, and he was working on the IPCC report and trying to find ways to distill this, how to distill this information as a scientist to everyone. And he felt that if he could get some of these images to capture the gravity of the situation, that maybe he will have done something in terms of communicating the science better. And so he was painting the watercolors and created haikus. There are a number of them, and you should Google it. This one seemed to be the most relevant and striking for me. Fast, strong action will reduce future warming with rising seas. Sure. And the other, in terms of thinking about solutions and problem solving, is one of the favorites from New Yorker, which consider the problem, then a miracle occurs, and then, well, it's done. I think we are all trying to be more explicit here on step 2. And these are my sort of modest attempts at that. Thank you.
So we have time for questions.
Hi, yes.
So has the example of Nauru, which was not climate-driven, been of much help, especially in the statehood and the nationhood area?
Nauru was compromised by intensive phosphate mining, and it has in the cautionary tale kind of way, but it has not in the sense that a lot of these Pacific Islands have relationships with other countries that make it a bit of a different kind of question for them. But it's not, there isn't a specific example, though it makes me want to kind of look back and see how that might inform some of the research. But yeah, as a cautionary tale for sure, because there's an element of this that's about how you manage through the next several generations, even if you know that you're likely going to lose habitability of the land. How do you manage that period in between? Is there a way to adapt in the interim?
So you said that there's no legal basis for the term climate refugee. Is there any sort of movement in international law to create some framework for thinking about these people who are climate migrants?
Yes, definitely. There's been a pretty rich discussion on this, and a number of scholars have written on it. And actually, Alex, you probably get this answer this question as well as I could. But basically, we are seeing there's several different camps. There's a camp, just to distill it down, that thinks that we should amend the refugee treaty or somehow incorporate climate refugees into that treaty so that you can have access to the rights of other refugees that other refugees have, and states are obligated in the ways that they are with respect to political refugees. There's another camp that feels that a separate climate change treaty, climate change refugee treaty would be appropriate. I would like to press on in that regard and then have better, more sort of scientifically appropriate and accurate ways of identifying who a climate refugee might be. And then there's another camp that thinks all of that is junk, right? And that thinks that who wants to have refugee status today? It's more of a stigma and a long-term, non-durable response to political pressures. The climate change treaty piece, the refugee treaty piece, is also seems to be a non-starter because, or difficult at the very least, because of how long it would take to get it to go, and all of the difficulties of identifying who would be able to avail themselves of that. And then there's some concerns too that perhaps there isn't anything that while all situations that force migration are unique and important, that the climate migrant somehow getting better or more focused or sophisticated treaty approach would be unfair or will not bridge the protection gap that other migrants have experienced and continue to experience.
Since sea level rise is a slow evolving catastrophe with timescale of centuries or longer, do you look that far out legally?
No. But the reason I pause is because I don't. Some people would, in the sense that some people think that law is really quite static and should be the same now and as it was centuries past, right? But I think that we're going to have to evolve, and the law will have to be as nimble in some ways as it addresses these issues. The specific research that I'm looking at, I think most people that are looking at migration, climate migration, they're looking at current forecasts about migration. And so what makes it difficult for, how do you determine the impacts of climate on the movement of people in South America, in areas of South America, for example, versus small islands where you can say the science is better for atoll nations with respect to how many generations you have left on that land based on the current science. And others here will be able to sort of articulate that even more accurately from a scientific perspective. But we're certainly, I like to make a distinction between the communities that we know today are likely to have to move within my lifetime or the lifetime of the young folks today, and those where it's multi-causal and there's a climate signal, but we may not see it as clearly until some time from now.
Do you see the guidelines for internally displaced persons helpful in the case of small island states? Because I find that in some sense people point to that as being an existing strategy, but when you actually look and examine the layers of that, they're just guidelines, right? And I think it gets to your point about the law makes things worse, where you think there's a guideline or a set of parameters, and then you try to apply them and they actually don't exist. So how does that shape like the evolution of small island states' approach to political strategizing on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think guidelines are tough, and I mean, whatever you're dealing with, internal affairs, if you will, right, and domestic policy has to be, internal migration has to be more guidelines. What you can do is, in your funding infrastructure, which is a whole other piece of this, by the way, that I'll set aside for now, but for the folks that are moving, for example, in the Carter Islands, to be able to fund this, have the appropriate kind of funding, and to make sure that economic development is a part of it, is very real and present tense, and the international community can have some say in how well communities resettle through that kind of vehicle, more so than trying to have any more sort of definitive on policy and internal matters. But the principles are there, and I think they're helpful. But you're right, principles are not in any way a sufficient replacement for actually having sound policy, whether it's again the finance piece or specifically one that deals with international movement that might actually domestic movement as well. I was just talking about the legal review guide mechanism in the context of the adaptation plan, adaptation policies, right? So there are a lot of places like Hawaii where we have guidelines on adaptation, and then we're also checked off as communities that have an adaptation plan. But what that means on the ground is completely different than how it appears on a survey of states that are acting on these issues. So that, I think, that problem of principles and guidelines giving the image of better resilience is a real one. It also does.
So you took up this list of a whole bunch of things we either know about and can't do anything about, or don't know much about, and then on top of that we could add the legal hurdles of things like mootness, potentially. Like you have ripeness and mootness and remedy and causality, right? You have all of these very accepts responsibility and says, okay, cool, we want to do something about this, then getting into court and finding responsible individuals, you have a whole separate set of issues. And one of the ways that law deals with dealing with new situations, right, is you look to analogous situations in the past. And I wonder if you've run into anything remotely analogous over the past, maybe centuries of people have been displaced, right? And are there any analogous situations to look at?
Okay, so yeah, this all great points, and if I could just sort of tease that apart a little bit, and just first say, that's right. I mean, the whole what's somewhat unsatisfying about a talk like this is that there's a whole layer of questions that can be thrown out there that we need to tackle. And so, and my concern is that we're not even at the stage where we'll acknowledge the existence of the phenomenon, and we haven't gotten past the you know, I mean, I hate to editorialize, but it's sort of this frustrating like quibble between migrationists and environmentalists, and you know, is environment really part of it? This is the rehashing the environmental refugees discussion from decades ago as well. And so what that all does is doesn't allow us to get to these really difficult questions, but I think if we all put our heads together and get to some pretty sensible answers on. I actually am really hopeful about once we actually start having the conversation, we have an SUV on Mars, right? We can figure this out. It's not easy. There are a lot of ethical questions that are faced that are probably more controversial than physics. But at the same time, you know, I think we can do it once we can get our heads around it. With respect to how courts deal with it, and causation and all of those pieces, I think this is definitely this issue more than any other in climate. It is really hard to imagine there being what we traditionally understand as legal responses, legal remedies to it in a way that one would, you know, you go to court and say, actually, for these reasons you've admitted I've been impacted for all the reasons that we know. So it is really about finding a policy or management response that works for those that are having to move and the host communities, right, and the country that's being left behind. And so, yes, when I was just in the question of statelessness, which is different from resettlement rights, which is from EPCs and all of the other sub-issues, I was looking for historical analogs. How can we look at past situations that sound even a little bit like this and get some clarity? And so I have a whole other PowerPoint on the statelessness question. And the first is that there are some historical analogs. They're not. It's very blunt and clumsy, right? I mean, it really is a new kind of scenario in the sense that we don't have, when Yugoslavia broke up, there was a predecessor state, a successor set of states that needed to be organized, and these were questions of which country do you now belong to? Not easy, but there was something there was land. We have a lot of examples that come out of places like the Sovereign Order of Malta, which I don't know if you've heard about. No. But the Sovereign Order of Malta is, so these are communities that were bound by religious, this is the Catholic order, and like the Vatican, it occupied a very small landmass in Malta, and then it was removed a couple of centuries ago from that space, and became everyone there and all that consider themselves citizens of the Sovereign Order were rendered sort of deterritorialized, but they still have a legal personality. They still meet many of the categories of state, although they're not states, they're permanent observers. They have relationships with other countries, they have a population, a permanent population. They have some of the other markers of statehood that would suggest that we've had deterritorialized entities before. We've had also, I mentioned to most people I talked to today, I'm from Jamaica originally, so I also have a very strong sense of diaspora and cultural identity that is sort of certainly at a distance from the land. The land still is there, and that's a unique difference. But these cultural diasporas also provide, I think, an example of how one can continue to be part of a nation that is deterritorialized. The Jewish diaspora is also a very strong example that's sometimes used as an analogous kind of scenario. There's also there was shortly before I gave the this first talk about statehood in New York in 2011, there was a major presidential election for the Tibetans. And this seemed to be a perfect example of how one might cultivate political and civic participation across, the globe, in which 55,000 people voted for the president of Tibet. And of course, it's a government in exile, and they're contemplated as temporary. But you can see that there are ways of cultural, sort of political and administrative, as well as even sort of strict legal definition, sort of meeting strict legal definitions to allow for deterritorialized statehood. So that was where I sort of looked for analogies. And again, I said they're sort of clumsy because none really fits the exact scenarios here, but they kind of piece them together to make, I think a sound argument. I don't know how long you can last, but that's it.
It seems convenient to think of climate change as a slow, long, gradual process, but the reality is probably that the impacts are going to be really abrupt and catastrophic. And I guess, when you think about islands getting inundated, it's probably not the long, slow flooding that matters. It's probably the flooding on top of a big storm surge that really displaces people. So I guess the question is are there good precedents for where legal laws or international laws have been worked out ahead of the catastrophe, or has it required catastrophes and big events to really have things shake out?
So we have international humanitarian laws that try to have a infrastructure to deal with catastrophes of all sorts from the front end. There are individual countries that have protected status for those who can't return to their countries as a result of a catastrophe. We have an actual, and in fact, to build on Andrew's question earlier too, in the resistance to go down the new treaty or amended treaty path, there has been a lot of research as to what is currently available that would help people that are going to move in, whether it's a sudden onset event or a slow onset event. And so we have these kinds of agreements. So the U.S. has a temporary protected status, and if your country has been devastated by the earthquake in Haiti or Honduras, the hurricane, you can stay in country. It's not contemplated, though, as one that's a long-term solution. It doesn't guarantee you citizenship. But there are countries in Scandinavia that have similar kinds of domestic laws that try to assist with communities, individuals who can't return to their communities as a result of an environmental disaster. There are bilateral agreements that some are trying to introduce or to sort of fatten up, if you will, to include situations that might cover migrants as a result of both sudden and slow onset disaster. Relationships between Pacific Island nation states and New Zealand and Australia are good ones to look at now because you see a lot of labor migration agreements that are being looked at with a sort of liberal interpretation to consider how you might allow people to migrate from the country to Pacific to those states.
I have a basic legal question. So obviously these are very complicated issues. Say a group of people are a good solution, then what happens? What? That's a great question.
Well, first we hope someone read your article, because more often than not, it doesn't happen. And in fact, this is why we just to kind of tip the hat to IGERT and these discipline. What you need to do is to be able to have these scholars get together, come up with good ideas, and then get that out to policymakers and have proper conduits for that. And so, and being able to speak in many different ways and many different disciplines so that it can actually get translated well on the ground work. So, I think a lot of what happens is that we scholars try to meet and come up with solutions to this, and then you may try to assist a delegation at the international negotiations to get something floated in language for the Paris Agreement, for example, and issues of loss and damage. All of these meetings that happen at the end of the year, these conference of parties meetings around the Framework Convention, climate change, they are preceded, each issue area is preceded by expert meetings and dialogues and drafting and all of those sorts of things. And those are ways in which I think scholars have been able to get some of these novel ideas at least into the text. But it's it's a process of kind of getting it written, published, and hopefully having someone read it and act on it, translate it into actual text drafts.
So I have a specific question about ocean acidification, and it's a legal question as well, so please let me know if this is too specific or not appropriate for one. But the first question, the legal question, hit on maybe why tort law is not the best remedy here, standing issues, cost of chain issues. Well, one of the other solutions when we don't have that is that's when we turn to legislative action, or as a sense of that, promulgation regulations through agencies. And again, forgive me for being the guy who's sort of fighting before the question. But one of the core issues looking at the regulatory framework seems to be that you've got, clean air from here, from water from here, but some of these pollutants, carbon dioxide, they're really transmedia pollutants, right? It's really from the air into the water and ocean acidification. Now I know the EPA has been sued to try to fatten out the pH regulations for main waterless states and have to give you a total maximum daily load requirement. That hasn't been successful. Do you think that's the best strategy to improve the regulations we have? Or is there another area of weakness that you would flag that could be about the regulations?
So, answering, I think yes is the answer. And most things that you would offer, I would say yes to, because we need, this is sort of a thousand cuts problem I described. I think we need all kinds of approaches. But for the ones that we know are maladaptive, the ones that make us more vulnerable or set us back, right? So I actually think, there's all of the creative ways that lawyers and legal scholars are trying to think about attacking the issues seem to meet their aim. And this will help, I think, that part of the question, our answer will help explain the second part, which is that I don't think tort law is completely irrelevant. I still don't. I may be one of the last holdouts. But carbon torts, okay, sure, maybe. Carbon torts are all of the litigation that's trying to connect, ex-oil and gas producers' carbon emissions to increase, parts per million, to increase temperature, to my house is destroyed because the storm was much worse than it would have been without that emission. That's the carbon tort. Okay, so there are difficulties. I've seen the writing on it. I'm not that convinced that it's that difficult if we put our heads together on this one, right? And if we allow for there to be a proper response to it. We also have really better data about who the traditional producers have been. So even if you can't get through the court of law with a tort, I think the naming and shaming of the public court could actually be quite helpful in this sort of more abstract sense of a carbon tort. But also tort law is relevant in terms of adaptation. And this is actually the paper I alluded here a few years ago at the Scholars Workshop, which was that, if you think about the typical tort for negligence, right, the elements of negligence, duty, breach, cause, and damages, what's relevant as far as what we know about the climate science comes in the breach stage. What was reasonable? What's reasonable action based on what you know, what you knew or should have known? And we have a ton of case law about municipalities, developers, and setting aside the sovereign immunity issue here for a second, but about a number of cases in which what was reasonable is not based on science that is 100% accurate about forecasting, but what we know, is likely to happen, and the decision you should have made is reasonable based on what you knew or should have known, again, what the science you had available to you at that time. So the perfect example is Sandy. I mentioned this earlier in one of the smaller group discussions. When Governor Christie was talking about the impact of the Jersey Shore, he kept saying, like, who could have known? Who would have thought? This is just, I can't believe this happened, and da-da-da. And, of course, all of the scientists at Princeton and Rutgers were like, well, we made this document, these series of documents, all this research backing up, we told you this is a bad idea. Okay, so if we were to look forward, he was then on a helicopter ride, Governor Christie, and he was looking around at the devastation on the Jersey Shore, and at the end of the ride he was asked, well, what are you going to do now? And he's like, well, of course, we'll rebuild it. And to me, that is, sort of opportunistic lawyer. There we go. This is essentially, this is unreasonable. This is not a reasonable reaction to what we know, what you know or should know based on the science in the past. So in some ways, I think the adaptation tour, which is just a reframing of typical, if a municipality builds a bridge that can't withstand what is known to be, the sort of standard design frequency, then you get damages for it. And I think that's important, and not because I'm litigious, because I don't think court cases people should sue just to sue. But I think it's important because it indicates to communities and decision makers in communities, developers in communities, what the kind of level of risk we want to introduce into our community. It may have some effect of compensating people, but more than anything else, it provides an opportunity when you're sitting across from a decision maker, and this is happening where you're sitting across from someone in the city and county, and you're like, you need to move your sewer lines, you need to shift this, you need to think about X, Y, and Z, and they're like, do you know how much this is going to cost? And you just look, and you say, yeah, it's going to cost a lot, but guess how much it's going to cost if you don't do it? And New York City knows. The Jersey Shore now knows. What happens if you don't do it? And the cost, or just putting that number on it, is one of the most effective ways I think tort law can actually, or at least exercises that get you to that point, is most valuable in making us more prepared at least for what's coming.
So I'm going to stop the questions and keep going, but definitely join us in the lobby and have a drink and keep chatting. I also want to make a plug for coming next week. We have Dr. Malin Pinsky from the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources at Rutgers University. And he's going to be talking about the impacts of climate velocity on coastal marine communities, but I think the underwater communities this time. So with that, let's thank Maxine.